All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming and joining us today. This is Our Communities, Our Voices, a youth-driven redistricting seminar. And this webinar is open for folks of all experience levels and ages, but we will be focusing on the basics of redistricting and how young people can get involved in this cycle. Throughout today's seminar, if you have any questions, make sure to put them in the Q&A box, which you should see in the lower right corner of your Zoom window. And we're going to do a couple introductions before we get started. So my name is Jane, and I am one of Common Cause Massachusetts interns this summer. I use the she series pronouns, and I am a rising junior at Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts, studying political science, civic studies, and sociology.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Devyn. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an intern for Common Cause Massachusetts alongside Jane. And I'm a student at UMass Lowell studying political science and peace and conflict studies. And for me personally, I feel like redistricting isn't something that people our age are necessarily seeking out or interested in at first glance, but it is an important part of our democracy. So it's really interconnected with voting and equity and a lot of other things. So I hope that you guys gain some knowledge today. And with that being said, I'll pass it off to Jeff. Jeff, if you want to introduce yourself and let everybody know about Common Cause.
Excellent. Thanks so much to Jane, Devyn. And hey, everyone, I'm Jeff. I'm the director at Common Cause Massachusetts. I'm just here to give a quick introduction and welcome everyone. I want to make sure you all know that Common Cause Massachusetts is really working with many other organizations on the front line to ensure our democracy is equitable and accessible. And in addition to doing work here around the redistricting process, we're also helping to coordinate a campaign to pass really powerful legislation at the state level called the Votes Act. We're also working to ensure government is performing as ethically as it should, and we're working to get money out of politics. So really trying to make our democracy as accessible as we can. And part of that is making sure we lift up key groups of folks who are active in our democracy, but who may not have equitable access to power. And so I really just want to appreciate Jane, Devyn for carving out a space today for young people to talk about the redistricting process and to get more involved. So thanks again, everyone, for tuning in. And Jane and Devyn, I pass it back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. And then we are also so excited to welcome Suzanne, who is the Redistricting and Representation Counsel at Common Cause, the national office. She's going to be helping us with the Q&A portion at the end of today's seminar.
All right. So looking at our agenda for today, it'll consist of defining what gerrymandering is. We'll discuss communities of interest and how you can use those communities to shape our districts. We'll look at the timeline for the 2020 redistricting cycle, and then we'll discuss how everybody here can get involved in the process. I know it sounds like a lot, but it'll all come together throughout the seminar, I promise. And like Jane said, if you have any questions throughout the seminar, drop them in the Q&A section at the bottom. We'll answer them at the end. And just to get a feel of the room, we're going to start things off with a quick poll question. We're going to ask you guys how much you already know about redistricting. So if you guys want to take a few seconds to answer that question, that'll be great. And then we'll move right on.
You guys should see a poll pop up in the middle of your Zoom screen. If you'll vote in that poll there, that would be great. And we'll review those results in just a second here.
All right, awesome. So I don't know if you guys can see the results on the screen, but it looks like 29% have no experience with redistricting, 50% have a little, and 21% have a lot. So that's pretty much what we expected from everybody. So we hope to change your knowledge by the end of the seminar. And then I'll hand it off to Jane.
Great, thanks, Devyn. So first, we're just going to go over what is redistricting. Essentially, redistricting is the process of redrawing electoral district boundaries. The 14th Amendment to the US Constitution requires us to even out district sizes, so each person is worth one vote. As many of you know, district lines are drawn and they can influence who runs and who wins certain elections. Redistricting is also based on the US Census, which is an official count of the population every 10 years, and that's mandated by the US Constitution. The census population count determines how many representatives each state will have in Congress for the next 10 years and how much federal funding communities will receive for roads, schools, housing, and social programs. The census allocates more than $7 trillion to federal, state, and local governments over the next 10 years. And another important point about US Census data is that the Bureau that works independently and it can't report or share any information with government agencies, including to law enforcement and immigration services. So that's the data that we're looking at when we're redrawing our district lines. So next we're going to chat about how district lines are drawn. Many states have additional redistricting criteria defined in their own state constitutions, but in general, they fall in line with the following guidelines. So the first is equal population. This constitutional standard was established by the US Supreme Court, and it means that all districts for representational bodies should be approximately equal in population. The degree of equality may vary in congressional plans versus legislative or local plans. And when you're creating maps, this will likely be called population deviation, which you want to keep as low as possible. Compactness refers to the minimum distance between all parts of a constituency. So a circle, a square, or a hexagon are examples of really compact districts, and various methods have been developed to measure compactness. And last is contiguity. This means that all parts of a district are connected geographically at some point with the rest of the district. And limits on that can be through geographical obstacles such as water, which vary by state to state in certain regulations.
All right, and before we dive into gerrymandering, we have another quick poll question, and we're going to ask you guys where you think gerrymandering originated. So you guys can just take a few seconds to answer that poll. All right, awesome. So 11% said California, 67% said Massachusetts, 6% said Missouri, and 17% said Texas. And the answer is Massachusetts. It actually originated here in Massachusetts, and Jane will get more into that.
Yes, gerrymandering does actually come from Massachusetts. It's an unfair redistricting practice where politicians pick their voters. I know it is a bummer, Becky. It was coined in 1812 as a result of Governor Eldridge Gerry's actions, which you can see on the side of this slide. And this is a political cartoon that was made. They called this district Gerry Salamander, which eventually morphed into what we call today gerrymandering. And one example of gerrymandering that Common Cause has been working on solving this summer is prison gerrymandering. Prison-based gerrymandering is the practice of counting incarcerated people as residents of the district in which they're incarcerated, rather than as residents of their regular home communities. And this typically puts more weight on the votes of typically whiter and more affluent suburbs where prisons reside, rather than typically lower income and more diverse areas.
All right, so what is BIPOC voting dilution? BIPOC voting dilution is a form of gerrymandering where district lines are drawn to suppress and silence BIPOC voters and therefore prevent them from gaining political power. This is obviously a violation of the Voting Rights Act and why we need to consider not only equal population, but also consider BIPOC voters through fair district lines. When we look at the image on the right, we could see a population with a 40-60 divide. This can represent any two different demographics. It could be Democrats and Republicans, or it could be BIPOC voters and white voters, et cetera, et cetera. So our goal with fair districting is letting each precinct's voice be heard. In the situation in the middle rectangle, you can see even though the precincts are perfectly equal in population, the red population is diluted, and because it is overpowered by the blue population, it gains 0 districts. And when looking at the rectangle on the right, you can see that the red population has 3 districts and the blue population has 2, but the districts are not very compact. You can tell that the lines are purposely including a certain demographic or purposely avoiding another demographic. So as Jane mentioned, you want to consider all 3: equal population, compactness, and that connectedness when drawing district lines. And then I'll pass it back to Jane.
So next, we're going to talk about communities of interest. And a community of interest is a neighborhood, community, or group of people who have a common policy concern or would benefit from sharing a single district. And another way of understanding this is that it provides a way for a community to tell its own story about what their neighbors share in common and what makes it unique compared to their surrounding communities. Most importantly, a community of interest is and should be defined by its local community members. So one example of a community of interest could be an area with a high immigrant population that speaks a language other than the official language of the country. So to define your community of interest, there are a couple main points to consider. First is data. What does your community have in common? What binds you together? And this data is, of course, going to come from the 2020 census data that was released in the last few weeks here. And then the story is what connects the people. Why is it important that you be kept together in one district? Stories can be a really compelling reason for legislators to keep communities together. So this is just as important, if not more important, than the data itself. And one important key factor to consider is that race and ethnicity may be one factor in community of interest, but it can't be the only reason why you're grouping that community together.
All right, and when looking at the 2020 redistricting timeline for legislature mapping, we start with the census data collection that takes place every 10 years, as Jane mentioned. For us, that information was released August 12th of this year. What we saw in Massachusetts was that our population is not only getting more diverse, but also getting older. Usually the census data is released in April, but with the pandemic, it was kind of pushed back to September. And as you can see at the timeline, it's kind of scrunched it all down and put it into a really tight timeline. So between now and November being when district lines and maps are approved, individuals are creating and submitting their own maps of how they believe districts should be drawn with this new and updated census data. People are currently also attending public hearings and testifying for their maps in their communities. Then once those maps are approved in November, those district lines will be the ones that we follow during the elections from the year 2022 to the year 2030. So that's why it's really important. For redistricting, it's not just the now, it's for the next 10 years, and it affects us and our communities. And it's also important to note that this timeline isn't like national, it's just for Massachusetts. Massachusetts maps are done through legislator, where communities put together their map ideas and form one ideal unity map and present it to legislators, whereas other states, they do this through more of a citizen-led process. And then, as I mentioned previously, community maps are considered when district lines are decided, and because who knows your community better than you, it's super helpful for you as a young activist to support, to submit your own maps. So to help you vision what that looks like making your own map, Jane and I will present our own example maps. So there's different levels of redistricting. There's congressional, statewide, county lines, citywide, and even local. So when creating district lines, it helps to look at the smaller picture, look at communities of interest, as Jane mentioned. And for my local map, I mapped out Lowell, Massachusetts, because that's where I'm from. So the yellow section, that is my university, UMass Lowell. So I included all 3 campuses and any important buildings. And then the blue section, that is a section of Lowell which contributes to its high Cambodian population. The community includes common interests such as Cambodian restaurants, Cambodian markets, temples, and common languages. And then zooming out and looking at the next slide, So when looking at state Senate districts, we have to create districts with almost the exact same population numbers. As Jane mentioned, the deviation and equal population. This is where mapping tools like Districtor and representative will come in handy, and then Jane will go more into deviation.
Thanks for sharing your maps, Devyn. So I did a smaller map with some state house districts. Something that is important to me is my university where I'm going to school is Tufts University, and it is split between the Medford and Somerville cities. So the campus, right through the middle of campus is the city line split between Medford and Somerville. So it was important to me when I was drawing how I would like state house districts to look, that Tufts be kept in one district instead of split like it typically could be. And I did a couple other districts here as well. One other that I want to mention is that I included Revere, Chelsea, and Malden all in one districts. I know that isn't the way they are currently outlined for elections, that they are Revere and Malden are grouped with Winthrop, which is a wider population. And so it's also a larger population. So it typically wins and weighs more than the votes of the citizens in those other towns. So that was something that I wanted to keep together. And if you look down in the lower right-hand corner there, you'll see my population deviation was pretty low. And that's something that is required by law. You have to keep a population deviation under, I believe it's 5% for state house districts. So keeping those as low as possible, making sure the districts are as even as possible is really important when you're pitching communities to your legislators. So we're going to talk really quickly about how you can make an impact. So as Devyn mentioned, some of the census data has already been released, but it will be all officially released in September. Like Devyn mentions, Massachusetts is getting more racially diverse and older. So I think it's even more important as young people to be contributing to this process. And that public opinion and input in redistricting lines is fairly recent in Massachusetts, so even more of a great reason to take advantage of it. So a couple things you can do to help with the redistricting process is volunteering with the Drawing Democracy Coalition or your local redistricting groups. You can write to your elected officials or write a letter to the editor of a newspaper, or you can recruit friends to draw maps with Representable, which I am going to demonstrate now. So Devyn just sent some mapping tools in the chat, and I'm going to hop on to Representable's website. I invite you all to do the same. And we're just going to walk through together how, if I were interested in mapping a community, how I could do that. So we'll scroll down to the Get Started section. I'm going to say my name is Dua Lipa and that I live on North Hollywood Avenue. And that I live in Boston, Mass. And that I live at 02133. I don't know if that is a Boston zip code, but we're going to go with it. And so this kind of describes to you what we've talked about today, what communities of interest are. And it's a geographic area that shares cultural, historical, or economic interests. And I'm going to make a fictional one today. And I'm going to say that I am in a community that has a pollution issue. So my community relies on the river for transportation and for fish. And we are really worried that having pollution in the area is going to, hurt our economy. So I'll fill out that info here. And then I'll scroll down and say, what are the main topics? We're worried about the environment. We're worried about keeping our fish affordable. So we'll go to next, and I'm going to name this community Fishing Town. And now I've hopped onto the map here, and I'll just say that this community is near this body of water in Massachusetts, in Sterling. So I'll say that this is, these are the lakes that we use, the reservoir here for our fishing and for transportation. So I want to keep all of this in the same community, all of this area of water. So I'll just start selecting areas to keep together. And you want to make sure that you're following the rules of compactness. You don't want to have some weird branching out districts or anything like that. And if I zoom out here, I can say, yeah, I mean, West Boylston is close, but it doesn't really include our community. And I think that they have a different, they rely on different things than what we would. So I'm happy with how this map looks. And I can save this map. And I can edit my info later. I can submit it to Representable, and they will use this when they're creating with the organizers of Drawing Democracy Coalition when they are working on their community mapping drive. And something that is very important to Devyn and I know all of us here at Common Cause, is making sure we are all heard in the unity map that is eventually submitted to legislators.
All right, and now for the Q&A portion of the seminar. If you guys have any questions, now's the time. You can put them in the Q&A section down below. Any question's a good question. But in the meantime, we prepared some questions that Jane and I thought of when we were going through our redistricting training. So I'll start off with, how can I stay involved with redistricting? So personally, I feel like after this seminar, you can go talk to your friends about it, educate other people about it. You could write op-eds, you can call your state rep, you can even sign up for notifications from organizations like Common Cause or the Drawing Democracy Coalition, and they'll keep you updated on redistricting. And then another question that we thought of is, how do I get involved if I don't live in Massachusetts? Suzanne, if you want to answer that question for us.
Sure. Hey, everyone. I am super excited to be here. So if you are not involved, or if you don't live in Massachusetts, the great thing about redistricting is that it happens everywhere, right? And so most states have some process where there is the availability for public input. And even in those states where, say, a legislature draws the lines, it doesn't really care what people think, there is still a lot of work being done on the ground by organizers and advocates to make sure that those stories that Jane and Devyn were talking about were really collected, right? Because that is kind of the cornerstone of the redistricting process that we're working on. So if you want to learn more about what's happening, I would recommend you go to commoncause.org/redistricting resources. There's a ton of information there, including a state-by-state analysis about like what you need to do wherever you are. You could also check out redistrictingcommunitycollege.com, which is part of a project that Common Cause is working on with 9 other national organizations that really pulls together all of the best brains that are talking about organizing around redistricting, and has collected resources and has trainings and all sorts of good stuff to really sign up and get involved.
Awesome. Thank you, Suzanne. Another question we thought of is, what if I'm new to my neighborhood and I don't know the area well enough to map it, or I don't feel confident mapping it and submitting it? So there are a couple different things you can do in this situation. One of them is that if you are, new to a neighborhood and you know one area of your neighborhood really well, but maybe not the others, getting connected with your neighbors and saying, okay, I know this area really well. Do you know this area well enough? And working together to create maps is one really good way to address that. Another way is that if you still have ties to another neighborhood, let's say you're a college student and you don't know your college community very well, but you know your home community really well, you're still a part of that community. So mapping where you grew up is also super helpful as well. So it looks like we have a Q&A question in the chat. And one person asked, how can I make sure my voice is heard in letter to the editor newspaper articles? Suzanne, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So when you're writing a letter to the editor, right, or an opinion piece, you want to make sure, one, that you're following the rules, right? So you are doing the research to find out what the rules for your local newspaper are. And then 2, you want to tell your story, right? One of the things that we know is really powerful is when people can say, hi, my name is so-and-so, I live in this community, this is what's important to my community, and this is why I want X results, right? And so using kind of that general template, I think really makes a difference.
Awesome. Thank you, Suzanne. We had another question from Becky in the chat. Is there an age limit to those that can testify about redistricting? If I'm not quite old enough to vote, but I know these maps will stay the next 10 years, I want to have a say. Becky, who made this question up. Devyn, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so as far as I know, there are no age restrictions. It's pretty much just you drawing your own map because the youth knows the community better than anybody else. You're going to be there longer than most people. So there isn't really an age restriction on testifying and talking about what you think is best for your community. I don't know if Suzanne or Jeff, you want to expand on that?
I can start and then toss it to Jeff or Jane if y'all have anything else. There is absolutely no age limit as far as I know, right? And what Devyn said is 100% right. You are the best expert about your community, regardless of how old you are. And in fact, if you are, a youth, if you're college age, if you're high school age, you have a different perspective on what is important to your community than probably some of the adults in the area, right? And so it's important for you to tell your story in addition, regardless of what else is happening.
Awesome. Thank you, Suzanne. We just got another question in the Q&A. Someone said, how can I share my knowledge with the people of Mass? So we're so glad that you enjoyed the seminar. And there are quite a few different ways that you can help share your knowledge of what you've learned today. One of them is volunteering with the Democracy Coalition. You can help share maps and teach your friends how to use Representable or Districtor, which is another mapping resource for those who might not live in Massachusetts. Volunteering, sharing, working with Common Cause and other organizations similar can really help share the knowledge. And I think one of the most important things with community mapping is sharing this information with your own community and making sure to engage those around you. So thank you for being interested in moving forward on this. Amy asked, what careers can I study to work more on this topic? Suzanne, as someone in this career, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Some of them seem obvious, right? So things like political science, things like government, things like history all provide a basis. I will say that my undergraduate degree is in international relations and then Spanish, right? So that is to say that you don't need a specific undergraduate degree, or you don't have to go to law school to do this work. It's really about making those connections, learning what it is that matters to you, possibly interning, possibly volunteering, and then ultimately, hopefully, working for an organization or working for several organizations in this space. I am not a person that's going to say you have to go to law school. I'm not a person that's going to say you have to be a political science major, although, I love some political science majors dearly. And I went to law school myself, but I think that there's lots of paths that you can take to get into this work.
Awesome. Thank you, Suzanne. While we're waiting on other questions, something that I was thinking about is that, what happens if I am involved in redistricting and I submit a community map and they don't map my community that way, and I have to deal with it for the next 10 years. Is there anything I can do in the meantime, or, am I just stuck with it for forever? And how do I deal with that as a constituent? Suzanne, I'll call on you.
Sure. So I think there's a couple things, right? First of all, I think it's important to understand that at its foundation, redistricting is about trade-offs, right? We have rules and we know kind of what a good representative map looks like when we see it, but it is almost impossible for every community to be represented exactly the way that community would like to. That is not to say that that's not an ideal that we should reach towards, right? That's what we want to happen. But there are just inherent trade-offs, because what happens if, say, there are multiple communities in the same area who have different interests, right? Or communities overlap in a way, or, there's all sorts of reasons that a community might get split up. So one is, depending on those reasons and depending on the impact of the split, litigation is possible, right? We know that people sue over district maps all the time. I'm not going to say that that's happening for sure in Massachusetts or not happening for sure, but that is a path that has often been pursued. You know, the other is to think about kind of what are the differences you can make in your community that have to do with organizing or educating your neighbors or advocating to whomever actually gets elected, right? Because we know that this is a process that is that builds on itself, right? We know that this year's redistricting process in 2021 is way more transparent and way more open and way more people are involved than were in 2010. So we can just keep working towards kind of that pinnacle where people are truly involved, where the map makers truly listen to people, and where we get districts that actually represent our needs.
Awesome. So another question from Stephen, I think in the chat is, Georgia was pivotal in the recent elections. How can I resource friends in Georgia regarding fairness in redistricting to stop gerrymandering? So you're absolutely right, Stephen, that fairness in the redistricting process can be one of the biggest ways to stop gerrymandering. I will toss this to Suzanne again, who is our expert on all things national.
Sure. Thanks so much. And thanks for the question. So there's a lot of work being done in Georgia. Unfortunately, Georgia is one of those states that has very few rules on redistricting and a legislature that is not particularly inclined to take into account what people want or what actual representative districts will look like. So a couple things. One, look for organizations who are doing work on redistricting. There's a Common Cause Georgia. There's also another number of organizations in Georgia who are doing this work, and feel free to donate to them. Two is, think about taking some of these principles that you learned today, things about community of interest and why we need to get to care about gerrymandering and maps, and taking them and educating your friends and family and whoever you know in Georgia, right? Because the more educated folks are in Georgia, the better those maps are going to be. And, even though there are a number of organizations doing really phenomenal work on the ground, there can never be too many people saying hey, here's some information about this thing that's really important to you all. I hope that helps. So I have a question back at you both, if I may. So say someone was not sure about why redistricting was the thing to care about this year, right? We're fighting for voting rights. We're fighting to make sure, healthcare works for everyone. We're fighting for economic policies. Why should people be focusing on redistricting, particularly, the youth right now in Massachusetts?
Go ahead, Devyn.
Okay. So like I said, it does happen every 10 years, but that effect is for that next 10 years. So you don't want to sit back and do nothing about redistricting and then 5 years down the road complain and say that you don't feel like your voice is being heard. I feel like now is the best time to get involved. And yeah, I'll bow to the Jane.
Thanks, Devyn. Yeah, I definitely agree. I think, redistricting is something that was not on my radar 10 years ago because I was a child, but it's something that I'm so glad to be a part of now, because it is something that is so long lasting. It is something that is has such a large impact on who runs for certain elections, who wins certain elections, who is chosen to represent us in our democratic process. And I think, knowing that, my volunteering and my helping to map my community could make someone, able to run for a position where they feel empowered to represent their community accurately and equitably is something that I find really empowering. So that's why it was so important to me this time around to be involved.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, of course. So it looks like we don't have any questions left. Feel free to send stuff in the chat. We'll be hanging out here for a little bit. But otherwise, we just have a couple resources to share with you folks. First, we want to thank the Drawing Democracy Coalition, as well as the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and the Black Political Scientists Coalition for training Devyn and I on redistricting. We want to give a huge thank you to Jeff, Suzanne, and Becky for all of their help and support in putting on this webinar. And we also want to thank you, the participants, for coming and joining. And we have a discount code for you. If you're interested in buying some Common Cause merch, you can use the discount code For the People, which I'll also send in the chat here, to get 15% off on some swag. We have some really cool stuff from the last couple of years about democracy and voting and all that kind of stuff. So we want to thank everyone again for joining us today. We've linked our email here at the bottom, CCMA interns, as well as the Drawing Democracy's website. Becky just put the website to get some merch in the chat, as well as the code. So if you're interested in repping your interest in an equitable democracy, you can get some swag there. And we'll hang around for a little bit if you have any questions. But thank you so much for joining us today.